So, good afternoon to everybody. Good morning to some of the people who are attending online and maybe in a different time zone. So this is the 23rd European Conference of the Fondazione Rodolfo Debenedetti, but it is the first of the post-COVID era that takes place with an hybrid presence. So we have some people here, as you can see, that are keeping the distance in this room, but there are many others that are following us online. The fact that we are back to have people in the audience is very nice because it is the interaction, but also those who are attending online will be allowed to intervene. And I think it's also a sign of the fact that we are moving away from this awful pandemic. Yesterday, Prime Minister Draghi said that we do see the light at the end of the tunnel, and we all hope that this is indeed true. At the same time, we must be aware of the fact that this pandemic has left scars, and there will be longer-term consequences on various dimensions we should be aware of and we should be prepared to deal with. So the main purpose of this conference is to bring and research analysis on this issue, on the long-term consequences of this pandemic. Let me start by reading the message of Engineer Carlo Debenedetti, President of the Fondazione Rodolfo Debenedetti, and I think we should thank him because of this series of conferences. They would have never been taking place without his generous contribution and initial intuition to create a foundation working on social policy and labor market issues. So I read the message because unfortunately he cannot be with us today. Today is the 23rd annual conference of the Fondazione Ingegner Rodolfo Debenedetti. This year I am not physically present to inaugurate the conference. I say this with regret, as I've always participated with great pleasure and interest in previous editions. Allow me, however, to make a few comments on the importance of the topic we have chosen for this event. As you know, the focus of today's conference is on the long-term socio-economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. In the first part of the conference, we will discuss the consequences of school closure in many countries to minimize the spread of the coronavirus. The decision, although regarded as necessary in the light of exceptionally serious circumstances, has in practice interrupted or at least slowed down the investment in human capital for children and young people, and therefore also their opportunity to accumulate knowledge and develop their potential through education at school. As the first study presented today shows, the cognitive and socio-emotional development of many children had been seriously hampered by school closure. Specifically, the children most severely affected come from families with a disadvantaged socioeconomic background or with pre-existing learning difficulties. This has amplified already existing inequalities in our society, hindering the fundamental role of schools as social equalizers. The literature dealing with the process of human capital accumulation is very clear on what we can expect in the future. We know that the loss of so many months of education will have long-term consequences both on the development of students' skills, on their incomes once they enter the labor market, and more generally on the macroeconomic performance of countries in the years to come. These consequences will be even more serious in the Italian context that even before the pandemic was already suffering from a serious delay in the development of young people's skills and of the workforce in general. For years, we have been at the bottom of international rankings comparing adult skills in industrialized countries, and even our students are struggling to close this gap. In Italy, the percentage of university graduates is still far below the European average. All this in an economic context in which skills are becoming increasingly important for better integration into the labor market and for sustaining economic growth. In past years, the Fondazione Engineer Rodolfo Debenedetti has addressed this issue on several occasions, and today it is once again stressing the importance of investing in the accumulation of human capital, inviting us to think about which policies should be implemented in this area to remedy the damage caused by the pandemic. However, as we will see later in the conference, students are not the only group to have been seriously affected by the measure implemented to minimize the spread of the coronavirus. The nationwide shutdown of non-essential activities combined with school closure had a serious impact on the employment opportunities of workers with children, particularly women. In fact, it is mainly women who had to cope with the increased childcare responsibilities caused by school closure. And it is women who paid the highest price in terms of employment and wage losses. Overall, it is clear that the pandemic has slowed down past progress towards gender equality. Finally, from the evidence gathered during the past economic crisis, we know that the prospect of those who enter the labor market for the first time in recent years are worse than those who did so during periods of growth. One of the studies presented this afternoon, will be the last study to be presented in the afternoon, will illustrate how this initial disadvantage suffered by young workers is likely to persist over time, with penalties of both an economic and social nature. So let me conclude by pointing out that the repercussion of the pandemic will be felt for many years, both in the economy and in our societies. Dealing with such repercussion, however, is not just a matter of economic efficiency, but of equity. If no action is taken to protect those groups in the population most affected by the pandemic, it will always be the most disadvantaged individuals who face change and suffer the most from these consequences. In this context, inequality will inevitably increase rather than decrease. I will stop here for my remarks. I do not want to take too much time away from the conference speakers. So this is the message from Engineer Carlo Debenedetti. We thank him for his contribution and also for having introduced already the topic of the conference and also the plan for the day. As you know, it's a very dense day where we'll have many presentations and also hopefully an active discussion and presentation. Everybody should sit, not on this part here. So before I give the floor to the first, for the presentation of the first report, we are going to display a message that we received from the Minister of Education, Mr. Patrizio Bianchi.
Let me thank you, the Rodolfo Debenedetti Foundation, to have organized this conference on long-term socio-economic consequences of the COVID pandemic, and in particular to have fixed this attention to the role of the school and the role of the relation between school and the economic system. I feel that the pandemic had a very heavy consequence on the long-term socioeconomic asset of Italy. But we cannot forget that most of the problems that pandemic stressed were very clear also in the past. When we are speaking about, for instance, the case of dropping out from our school after pandemic, we cannot forget that the dropping out was a phenomenon very strong also before the pandemic. We have to consider that most of the regions in the north was at the same level of Germany, but most of the regions in the south, in particular the periphery of the big cities of the south, were in the condition that 1 on 3 students were dispersed. That means that 33% of the people that were not able to arrive at the end of the course, and if you consider also the Invalsi data that Roberto Ricci can explain to you, a huge number of people, they reached the diploma at the end of the course, but not having the proper competencies of the period. I feel in this sense that we have a lot of work to do in order not just to fill the gap from the pandemic, but also to put the entire system on a different trend. We have to work in order to elevate the level of cultural level of not only of the students, but of the entire population of Italy. In particular, we have also to work much more to work on the transformation of industrial system. When we are working on the transformation of the industrial system, it's quite evident that we have to work on the preparation, the initial preparation of the students, but also to reskilling of most of the people that now are still working in the industrial activities. So that in this sense it's clear that on my perspective, that is the perspective of education, we are not just working in the reform that we have necessary to do in order to induce our system to be at the level that we are expecting in order to go over the pandemic. But we have also to work on the entire system of human resources that now are working at industrial and more or less in the socio-economic context of Italy. In this sense, it's clear that most of the experience that we are doing now are extremely important. We have a variety of experiments that are really working in this sense, able to provide not only technical skills, but also what we can call character skills. That means the way to work together. I'm still convinced that efficiency is not only a matter of specialization, but is a matter of specialization plus complementarity. The capacity to induce people to work in a complementary context means also to induce people to adjust themselves with respect what the other are able to do. In this sense, it's clear that we need a deeper analysis of the productive transformation of the country. I'm not convinced that we are very clear which is the trend of transformation of the country. I'm not convinced that we are taking all the consequences of the deep climatic change, and I'm not convinced that we are able to catch up all the opportunities derived from the digital revolution. In this sense, it's clear that we have to work more together, but it's also clear that education could be also one of the drivers of the more general socio-economic transformation of the country. So that on one side it's clear that we have to work to understand better the consequences of the pandemic, but we have to analyze also the long-term transformation of the country and the world, and on the other side, design experiences in education and in the education connection with a more general long-term education that we have done in the past. So let me once again thank you to the Foundation Rodolfo Debenedetti for this analysis, this deep analysis, but I think that we have to work much more, and we have to work much more all together. Economists on one side, sociologists on the other side, experts of schools on the other on together, but in a real multidisciplinary approach, because we are facing a complex system. And complex system needs also innovation in our scientific approach. So let me thank you once again, and my compliment to the Foundation.
I think we are here to take up this invitation of the Minister to work together and to try to, first of all, assess the extent of the losses, of human capital losses during the pandemic, and clearly also to see remedies to it. So we start now with the presentation of the first report. The report is on the legacy of COVID-19 in education. That has been drafted by Ludger, Woessmann, and Katharina Werner. It will be presented by Ludger Woessmann, who has an impressive list of publications on top economic journals, and he's been pioneering work on the economics of education. He's currently director of the IFO Center for the Economics of Education and professor of economics at the University of Munich. He's also a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So, Ludger, I invite you to come here and present, and I will leave this part of the floor because so that you can speak without the mask. So, Ludger, the floor is yours.
I've got water here, thanks.
So you have 40 minutes.
Okay, good.
I will keep the time.
Okay, thank you so much for having me, Tito. It's so great to be here, to see other people in the room with the necessary conditions here. It's literally been my first flight since the COVID times, and I realize how important it is to interact in real terms, and so I really appreciate being here. I mean, the overall topic has been nicely introduced by Mr. Debenedetti and by Tito. No, I've got this one. Does it work? Yeah, okay. Seems like we're okay. So basically the task that Tito gave us, and as he said, it's joint work with Katharina Werner, who's also in Munich, and actually right now, that's right. Okay, thanks. So amazing, you get so used to the mask that you keep on wearing it. She's actually right now for a year visiting at Harvard at the Kennedy School, so she can't be here, unfortunately. So when he gave us this task of kind of trying to review what we know so far actually on what may be the legacy of COVID-19, of the school closures in the school system, I think we didn't quite realize how much work it's going to be to cover all that. And we have this pretty big report there now. Let me give you an idea of what I want to walk through over the next 40 minutes. So I'm going to skip the general motivation in general because we already got that, and I think we jump right into the topic. We propose a conceptual framework that's pretty simple, but like just to organize our thinking of what economists like to call an education production function. And I'm going to introduce that in a minute, because that actually helps us to structure what we know so far and actually also what we don't know and where we have to make assumptions and see where we are. And that allows me then to talk in the third part first on the different inputs into the education process and how COVID-19 may have affected that, both by the children themselves, by their parents, and by the schools. And then the next two parts will look at the main outcomes and what we know so far about them, both on the cognitive side, so the cognitive skills, but also on, well, what economists often call the non-cognitive skill part. I think we increasingly try to avoid that term because it's kind of meaningless, because it's kind of everything that's not cognitive and not quite clear. So I do want to call it socio-emotional development, which gives you two of these aspects beyond the cognitive development that are probably particularly important in terms of the school closures. And after that, I'm going to have two parts where we think about what the longer term consequences may be, and there's two different approaches basically to looking at that: structural modeling or basic reduced form projections. I'm going to talk about that a little bit and try to close with policy conclusions. So what are what can we do to improve the situation? So basically the long-term legacy that's going to be there will depend a lot on what we do now, and there's still a lot of room, I think, to change that. So any of these projections will only be conditional projections of depending on what we're going to do. Okay, so this idea of an education production function is really very, very simple. You basically, like any production function, you think of an output, and that's produced by several inputs. The output here, I mean, just technically in much of the literature, is often just measured by student test scores in math and science and reading or other things. But I really want to think about it much more broadly in terms of the overall skill development. So any skills that children acquire when they're young that then may be relevant for how they can live a healthy, wealthy life. So in that sense, it's very broad. So think about here both of the cognitive skills, about the socio-emotional skills, in a sense, then also about the long-run outcomes, whether they get good jobs, how much they're going to earn, any other life outcomes really. And so these are going to be a function of a series of inputs, and I think it's easiest to think about three groups of inputs. The first one's going to be student inputs, and often people think here just about student ability that's going to be relevant for student learning and for how much skills they're going to develop. But of course it's much more broadly. It's like students' effort, engagement, and so on, which I think is going to be a super important aspect of the school closures and how they're going to affect outcomes. Also family inputs and school inputs. So let's start with the school inputs. I'm going to be very brief here, but this will give us some structure for the remainder of the talk. We talk some more about that in the report. So in that sense, we can think about COVID-19 and the related school closures as a strong reduction in school inputs. And there's some evidence from evidence we've got from Germany that shows that the main interaction of students with teachers, for example, for quite a while totally evaporated, so went to close to zero. And so this is basically how you could define the school closures. It's a reduction in school inputs, and particularly a sharp decline in the support of trained teachers. And I think this is important to think about this. So a huge part of what we know from this education production function literature is that teachers are probably the most important input in the learning process beyond the children themselves. So it's not so much class size or anything like that. It's really like how good the teachers are. But now if the teachers all of a sudden are no longer in the room, the kids sit at home, maybe connected online, maybe not, you can see how this super strongly changes this process of skill development. And that children that strongly depend on these trained teachers will all of a sudden not be able to learn a lot. Which means that now learning is moved to the home, will depend much more on self-regulated learning, where you've got to just read and organize yourself, but read the material yourself, understand it yourself, and then do the applications. And we're going to get in a minute to the implications of that and what that means for different students. But in general, it's kind of obvious that what Horace Mann, the famous American pedagogue, long ago called the function of schools as the great equalizer, will all of a sudden be severely limited. Which means then, we're always talking basically about two dimensions of outcomes. The one is the overall level of skill development, but the other one is the inequality in skill development. And that's I think, part of the big theme that we're going to see here. It also means, and some people have stressed that a lot, that closing schools means that you will likely separate peer groups that otherwise would be jointly together in schools. And for example, for some students, this may mean that basically the peers that you meet in school are now substituted by peers you mostly meet in your neighborhood, which probably means that there's less interaction across different social strata and so on, which again will probably reduce the overall peer experience for disadvantaged children. That gets us into the second part of the inputs, and these are becoming much more important now with the schooling moved from schools to homes, which is family inputs in general, and then in particular the parents. And they become now much more crucial, of course. And so we often probably first think about parents' income, what they can invest there, the home environment, whether kids have an own room, whether they have internet connection, whether they have computers, and all that is important. But I guess overall from the literature, we have a feeling that what's probably even more important is parents' time, investments into their children, their effort, their encouragement, to what extent they're actually like try to convey to the children how important it is to still learn. And then their cognitive skills, because all of a sudden they become the substitute teachers not in the room, and then that will be important. And then maybe even more important, the pedagogical skills. I don't know if anybody of you has had children at home during the time. Many parents really got totally frustrated to try to interact with the children and got a much more appreciation of these important work and hard work that teachers are doing. And one aspect of that then again is that there's probably going to be a huge difference in the inputs here between high socioeconomic background families and lower socioeconomic background families. So this is the overall meaning of social inequality. And so there's at least 3 reasons why you would expect inequality to increase along this dimension. The first one is simply that, like, whatever, higher SES parents have more income, more resources, and so the budget constraints are much less, and lower SES parents are much more constrained there and can invest much less into the children then. The second aspect is that, well, the extent to which parents really think that education is very important, so in a sense to what education enters their utility function, can differ a lot and will probably differ along this dimension. And the third dimension is what we already talked about, like the extent to which parents can actually manage the curricular content and convey that. And all these lead to the expectation that children from disadvantaged families will be much more harmed by the school closures. And then the third group of inputs is from the students themselves. It's kind of a super crucial aspect to be aware of. So different from most other production processes, you can only produce education if, like, the consumer, the students themselves, are part of it. They are a key input factor. You cannot, like, produce education if the person who's meant to get it isn't participating. So there's not going to be any skill development without students putting in effort and engagement in learning. And this may be particularly hard at home at some stage when kids are really in this very difficult situation during the pandemic. Now, coming back to this idea that learning is moved to the home and you will have to, like, do much more on your own. You don't have a trained educator in the room, meaning that you need to have much more self-regulated learning. We have argued that this is actually going to be likely a second dimension of inequality that's going to be very important here, and that's not so often discussed. So people have discussed a lot the inequality by socioeconomic status or by the educational background of the family, and I think it's super important. But there's a second dimension, which is depending on their own, like, prior achievement level of students. So think about just students like students that have gotten very good grades beforehand and students that have gotten relatively bad grades beforehand. If you just move it to your home and you just have to study the thing yourself, so what many schools have just done is send kids working task sheets and tell, okay, read the stuff in the book and then try to do these tasks. That may vaguely work for high achieving students because they, like, have the capacity to, like, get into the material themselves. But even if they're motivated, low achieving students may just fail. They read in the book, don't understand the work and that's the end of the story. And therefore I expect if these inputs are important, that these are going to be increasing inequality between high and low achieving students. So particularly hardly hit are going to be low achieving students and students from low SES backgrounds. There could be a correlation between the two, but conceptually these are really different aspects. Okay, this is the overall background. We talked a little bit about these inputs. In the report, we also talk a little bit about how probably even the functional form here is going to be very important, and actually the effectiveness, like kind of the elasticities with which some input factors go into the production function will depend on the existence of other input factors. So this is the way you could actually, like, if you reduce school input factors by the school closures, all of a sudden the production elasticity of ownability of the kids is going to get much more important. Because in schools, there's a teacher that helps low SES kids learn, whereas at home they aren't, and all of a sudden actually it's not just the level of inputs, it's also the production elasticities that may actually be affected by the pandemic. Okay, so with this in mind, now let's jump into what the literature has shown so far. And I'm going to start out with measures of the inputs because we don't have super good output measures on several dimensions. We know maybe a bit more about the inputs, which, like given this framework, gives us some ideas of what was happening. And these are basically then surveys of how students fared during the pandemic, particularly time use surveys of the time that children spend on school-related activities, but also on other activities, preferably both during the pandemic, but also before the pandemic. So you've got some comparison, like on what, like to what extent, for example, any differences by socioeconomic status had been there before and anyway, or actually are part of the pandemic. But beyond this evidence on the children, some surveys also, or actually probably even more surveys, have some information on the activities that parents and schools have been doing. And I want to focus a lot here on two specific surveys that we did ourselves from Germany, just because I know a lot about it and because part of it, this was really done for this report. Not saying, so I'm going to close also with evidence from other countries that is around there as well. But what we did is actually, during the first school closures, which in Germany, like everywhere else, started in March 2020, they basically went, well, this was huge regional and great heterogeneity, but went easily until June for most students. There was a lot of public debate, of course, and we got a feeling that most politicians were saying, look, it's a big special situation, but actually by and large we're getting through okay. And basically on the ground, as most people, most parents, I think, had a feeling that no, we are not. And so, but there was no evidence. I mean, there was testing was discontinued, which is understandable. There's literally in Germany, even talking with some of them, I had a clear feeling that they didn't even want to know because they had a feeling that it's going to be negatively backfire. And at some stage, we then realized we got to do something because we want to have at least know the facts before we can talk about anything else. And so we did. We had anyway planned a big annual survey. It's more like an opinion survey that we have been doing for 8 years now, representative of the German adult population in Germany, and we used that to actually the subsample of parents of school children to give them additional questions on the current situation. And so that first survey was like fielded in June 2020, and we asked them explicitly about this like phase of the school closures. We surveyed a bit more than 1,000 parents that, in terms of observables, are representative of the German population. And then, basically, when Tito and Paolo started to talk to me at the end of last year, they said like, oh, it would be nice to get some additional new evidence in here, and we had different ideas. And at some stage, I said, look, it would be real. Like, it looks like they're going to close the schools again. And I really want to know whether schools have adapted, whether families have adapted, and to what extent can we do a second survey. And thanks to the grateful support of the foundation here, we could actually then do that. And so we have a second survey just done for this report in February, March 2021. So schools were basically closed again just before Christmas, and then they kept closed for another 2-3 months again, really. And so we are right there in the middle of the second big nationwide school closures. We there surveyed 2,000 parents, and the part of the nice thing about it, it has a longitudinal component. So first of all, we could actually ask the first, like the 1,000 parents we asked the year before, again, whether they participated, and basically half of them did, so a bit more than 500. We have an individual longitudinal component where we can then really observe how schools and families, like at the individual level, have changed during the pandemic situation. So let me jump into it with the data that we have. So first, big thing that, like, main component really of the first survey is really a time use survey. So we asked the parents, so parents are the ones who give us the information, what their kid did on a usual day during the pandemic, and then they got the same question for a usual day before the pandemic, usual school day, and basically they could answer this in half-hour slots. We had given them several activities, on a list where they can put in like 1 hour, 2 hour, 3.5 hours, and they could actually fill in additional items there. And literally more than half of them did, so you could already see that parents were really engaged in this survey. I was quite impressed by that. And then we recoded these into our categories. So 2 of the categories that we gave them, obviously, is the first one is attending school in person, and the second one is learning for school at home. And what you basically see is on average here, so these are the average numbers, before the pandemic, a kid would usually spend 7.5 hours on school-related activities, 6 hours in school, and 1.5 hours homework, basically. And this is like really representative on average across primary school and the different types of secondary schools. You could go more deeply into that if we do that in one of our papers if you're interested. And then what we basically saw there, and there was one of the big headline numbers in the German news for several weeks, is that basically the learning time was cut into half effectively during the first pandemic. So we have like schools were open just for a few children from like system relevant parents who were working in system relevant jobs, and so this is on average about 1 hour, and then you got this additional 2.8 hours. This is based on this sample of 500 students that we did observe over time, but it's very similar for the representative overall sample. So you get a bit more than 3.5 hours of work. And so this, we don't know how effective their work at home was. This is just time inputs, but you could see that like it was a real difference and it was just cut in half. And so we asked the same battery of questions again in early 2021 during the second school closures, and you can see there's some increase there, not in in-person schooling, but in working at home. So it's kind of 4.5 hours then, so kids did adjust a little bit, but it's still 3 hours less than on a usual school day beforehand. So even like after 1 year of pandemic, we just didn't get very far, to be honest. What we stress in in the first paper that you can find online if you're interested is that in this reduction during the first phase, the reduction was substantially larger for low achieving students, just defined as being students below the median grade in math and in German before the pandemic. So it was half an hour more reduction compared to high achieving students, consistent with the framework that I was just suggesting. Interestingly, actually, before the pandemic, high and low achieving students spent exactly the same amount of time on learning, and then the reduction was much more severe for the low achieving ones. Actually, in the second survey, it's not as clear anymore, and actually in the sample of that we observe over time, we don't have enough statistical power for these subgroups to be very sure what's happening. So it seems like the difference has decreased somewhat, but it's actually like it's really like an open question. But what we do know and what we did observe in the second survey now is that the effectiveness of learning at home actually was very different for low and high achieving students. So kind of with this first time use survey, one of the questions that we often got and ask ourselves is, but to what extent is 1 hour of learning at home better or worse than 1 hour of learning in school? And then we thought, like, why don't we ask parents? Of course, it's just their assessment. Take it for what it's worth. They may not know the truth or not tell you the truth. So you've got to be aware of all these limitations, but at least you get an idea. And so we just asked them, like, think about how much do you think your child learns during an hour of learning? So it's like this within 1 hour. At home compared to 1 hour of learning and regular instruction in school. And so per hour, the child learns much more at home, rather more at home, equally, rather less at home, much less at home than in school. And you see that like a substantial majority says you actually, per hour, you learn less at home than in school. Which means that actually in that sense, if that's true, the learning time reduction even underestimates the reduction in learning. Interestingly, there's also this like 22% of the sample who say actually they learn more at home per hour than in school. So I think we have to take that for real. There's going to be real heterogeneity. There are some children who are actually even happy to work at home. They may actually be faster learning at home and it may be good for them. But this is a minority, but it's not zero. And the majority actually learns less at home in school. But an important aspect here is that there's really significant differences between low and high achieving, just in the simple cutoff. Even here in during the second phase of school closures in Germany, that you see that the share of students that learn less at home per hour than in school, according to their parents, is much higher for low achieving students than high achieving students. Again, this is I think this is consistent with this conceptual framework of high achieving students, they may actually have the self-learning and self-regulation skills to learn at home in a better way than the low achieving students. And we do see a difference, not as pronounced, but also clearly there between academic parents and non-academic parents. So it's just defined as like a parent has a university degree or not, just a simple split of the population, like one measure of socioeconomic status. We do see these differences here as well. And here's more. I'm sorry, we basically cannot even read that, but you get the basic idea. I want to tell you what's on there. So in the second survey, we also asked a bit more about the learning experiences at home. So for example, we asked parents, to what extent does the following statement apply? When my child learns at home, it is very concentrated. And the green ones are, it fully applies or rather applies, and the red ones are rather doesn't apply or doesn't apply at all. And what you see is, first of all, this kind of amazing, do they agree that the child learns very concentrated? It's really a 50-50 split in the overall population. It's amazing. It's like you can hardly ever see a disagreement as strongly as that. So again, the heterogeneity. And part of the heterogeneity, that's what I'm showing here, is again by these high and low achieving students. So there's a huge difference to what extent the parents say that the child learns concentrated between high achieving students and low achieving students. And the same is true for many other items in the battery that we asked there. So when my child learns at home, it is well organized, a very different picture. At home, my child learns independently, or when my child learns at home, it often does not make progress. When my child learns at home, it is often distracted. So you see that there's a real difference, and part of the difference is really along this achievement dimension. And I would put up the same pictures for parental education. They are not as stark, but there are also differences on that dimension. Okay, so we got some idea what was happening at home, what are the learning experiences at home, to the extent that you can get it from surveys, I guess. Let's get back to the time use survey. So I showed you this picture. That was the first part, but I think the really nice thing about time use surveys is you can actually not just see the learning time, but actually what they did instead. What did they substitute it for? And I mean, at first I was like, sorry, we cannot really measure cognitive skills. It's really a big downside by any of these surveys. But this other part is something that gives you a much richer picture as well, which I actually afterwards kind of liked. And so here's a second group of activities that parents say their child spend time on, that we would group into other activities that are somewhat conducive to child development more generally. And it's actually, we also asked parents in the first survey whether they think these activities are good or bad for the child development, and they totally agree. These are the activities where they think it's positive, and the next group is going to be activities where they think, no, they're not that good for child development. So it's like reading, creative work, or physical exercise. And you can see actually during the first school closures, it's all at a much lower level, but that increased from 2.8 hours to 3.1 hours per day. And actually during the second closures, though, it actually went down again, even before, like below pre-pandemic level, but that may actually be a seasonal effect with physical exercise. But it's not that actually that increased. So that was reduced quite a bit when kids started to spend some more time learning again. And here's the other group, and this is like watching TV, playing computer games, spending time on social media, spending time on online media. And all these, you can have different views on whether these are conducive or detrimental. Most parents think that these things are detrimental for child development, and I would agree, but this is debatable. Take it as what it is, it's the time they spend on it. And that really increased big time during the pandemic, from 3.8 hours before to 5.1 hours in the first closures. It did go down as well when kids spent some more time learning during the second closures, but it's still much higher than pre-pandemic. And this increase, and particularly in the gaming time, is much larger for low SES kids, and it's particularly large for low achieving students compared to high achieving students. So instead of learning, they're playing computer games. This is really the reality there. And if you look at it, I mean, it's still the case that they spend as much time on this than on any learning activities on a usual school day. It's not weekend, it's school day. In the second phase of school closures, and they spend much more time on these activities during the first school closures. Okay, this was a lot about what the child inputs. What do we know about parental and school inputs? And I see that I really have to speed up here. So briefly, we did ask the parents how much time they spend together with their child on these different activities. And there's one aspect here, at least to see, they say before the pandemic, they spent about half an hour each day supporting their child learning at home, and that increased, like nearly doubled to like a bit more than an hour in both parts of the school closures. So it's not that they all of a sudden spend 3-4 hours with them, but it did increase substantially. But even here we actually see that they spend less time rather than more time with their low achieving students, which means that the parents did not really compensate the inequalities. If anything, it's the other way around. They spent more time with high achieving students. And here's what schools did. So we asked the parents, okay, how often does your school do the following things during the school closures? So what did the schools do when the schools were closed? And we have the same battery in both questionnaires. So during the first school closures, so this is the first item, is how often do they do joint lessons for the entire class, so basically online schooling, really video schooling. And you go from green daily on several times a week to once a week, less than once a week, or never. That's what they answered. And what you see is, I mean, this was a big bomb in the German media. Basically, it was 7% of schools that had daily online schooling in one way or the other, when like basically the education ministers gave this picture of that everybody has online schooling now. And you see that more than half of them had it less than once a week. But you see that actually during the second phase, that actually changed quite drastically. So schools did adapt after a year quite a lot to the extent, well, but still it's only true that it's a quarter of the students who had daily online schooling. The others had less than that, and it's still true that nearly a quarter had it less than once a week. So there's still these substantial differences, and it's not in Germany. So this is Germany, and there's going to be real differences in different countries. It's not that like the reality, even after 1 year of the pandemic, when schools were closed, is that kids like learn by video. So we had this other question on like how often were there individual conversations of the teachers with the kids. So if you couldn't connect online or something, you might as well take the telephone and call the kids or something. But that was even less actually. That hardly ever happened. And we have a battery of other things, how often they use learning software and so on. But like just to give you the idea of what mainly happened is like nearly all of them just got, the schools provided the kids with assignments that they had to complete individually at home. That's nearly all the kids got that. And then already the fact that teachers provided feedback on these completed assignments was much lower, was not uniform, but also increased somewhat over the part of the pandemic. So this was our German evidence on all these things. It's probably somewhat richer than what we know in most other countries, but there's very interesting work in other countries that I think as a general pattern gives you a very similar picture, although the specifics are actually quite different, and so it's a bit hard to give the full picture here. But what we clearly see in time use surveys that have been done in the United Kingdom and in the United States is there's this huge pattern of differential effects on children from different backgrounds. And they are actually much stronger than in our one, also by socioeconomic status. And there's also a US survey of teachers and principals that draws a very similar picture really in the United States. let me skip one of these things to get to the other parts. Then we know quite a bit, there's quite some studies also looking at what happened in families and to parents. And it's clear that the patterns of family life were disrupted during the lockdowns. We're going to talk, I hope, much more about that in the afternoon, so I'm going to be brief here, but there's the work showing that the work patterns were changed, the allocations of chores in the household changed, household tensions increased among parents. There's this one study that actually looks at mental health of adults during the pandemic, and what it shows that it decreased particularly strongly for parents of school-age children who are working and at the same time doing homeschooling. So this was a huge impact on the parents as well. A big chunk of the burden of the additional childcare chores fell on mothers rather than fathers in most studies that look at this. And we already heard that this probably going to have or may have repercussions in the equality dimension across genders here. The effect to what extent, for example, so this likely means it has been shown that mothers were more likely to reduce their working hours and things like these. What effect did these labor market consequences of the pandemic have for the children is a bit less clear. There's, for example, this one UK study that looks actually at unemployment spells of fathers, where they show that actually when the father loses a job, basically, the paid learning resources of the kids go down, so there's a clear negative effect, but actually the parental help time increases. So it's not absolutely clear what that ultimately will mean for the children. And there's also other studies, also here for Italy, for example, an interesting study that shows at least an interesting correlation between the involvement of fathers in childcare and schooling at home with children's emotional well-being. So if fathers participate in it, that actually has a positive or is positively related to emotional well-being. And it actually reduces the time that children spend on TV and passive screen time in general. There's also evidence out there showing that the situation of the parents is really strongly mediated by what the schools are actually doing. So there's this interaction there. For example, there's this one US study doing a difference in difference approach, looking at different school districts with different intensity of school closures and showing that where schools were closed more longer and more severely, the labor supply of parents went down much more strongly. I'm not quite sure whether this is causal. It could still be caused by other things that go on at the same time, but still you see that these things do interact. And in Germany, there's a study showing that when there's access to emergency childcare policies, like when this is particularly also for at the preschool level, what they can show is that it's correlated with a reduction in, or with lower parental behavior that's very harsh and probably not very good for the children. Interestingly, they don't actually find a correlation with parental well-being in general. And also here, this Italian study has shown that the quality of the children's at-home learning time, the way they measure it, is actually correlated with the type of what schools do in terms of distance teaching. And the final aspect is that, of course, if school resources go down, parents start looking for alternatives, and to a differential effect, so probably higher SES parents are much more likely to do that. There's been this interesting study by Bacher, Higgs, Goodman, and Mulhern showing in the US that with the pandemic, they basically use Google search data looking at search engine usage for online instruction terms, and that increased big time, very quickly. And this particularly so in areas that are high income. So you see a differential effect there. Or another more recent study shows, it's based on data from Massachusetts, that if schools went to more remote learning rather than in-person instruction, the enrollment in public schools is more likely to go down, meaning that probably more and more parents then choose private alternatives that offer in-person instruction. So a lot of these behavioral responses are happening there. But overall, I guess there's clear evidence from all these studies that the inputs into the learning process of the children, both from the children themselves, from their parents, and from the schools, changed a lot, were reduced mostly and only partly compensated by homes. And there's this huge differential depending on disadvantaged and less disadvantaged backgrounds. So likely to expect an increase in educational inequality. Okay, so what do we learn in terms of real outcomes? The standard way we would go for this is look at math tests, science tests, reading tests, and measure that. Most of these testing was ever actually discontinued during the pandemic, but there's a few countries or a few areas where we have data and some studies that look at it, and that's really great and super interesting and important. In the report, though, we actually do emphasize two main problems that I quickly want to talk about here, because it's very important for us to see how we then interpret the evidence that we have, which I think is not always particularly well done, because we basically want to derive implications for what are the impact of the school closures, and I'm not quite sure that most data allow us to do that. The first very simple point is that there may be classical cohort effects, as we call it in economics. It's just the fact that any cohort may, for whatever reason, for many reasons, like be better or worse than the previous cohort. And I mean, the extent is very clear, like when you look at PISA, International Achievement Test, countries go up and down over time. These are basically the cohort effects without a pandemic. The problem now is, in cross-sectional data, we don't have a convincing control group contemporaneously, because the school closures basically hit all the students in most countries. So what the available studies generally have to do is they just compare achievement of the affected cohort with how previous cohorts did on the same test 1 year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. But of course then, like, you cannot disentangle to what extent this is different, and only few, like if you look at some of these studies, actually they compare to the 3 previous years, but the difference in the within these 3 previous years are so large that you basically are out of power to identify the actual effect of the school closures. So how to get around that, and this is why I basically want to highlight one study here. This is the one by Engzel and co-authors on Netherlands data. That is really the only one, I think, from which we learn something very clear, but then again it's very restricted as well, but at least methodologically very important. So they have this nice thing to have, basically you need individual level longitudinal data. You need to know how these kids actually did before the pandemic to see how much they learned during the pandemic. And the cool thing in the Netherlands is they actually have, in primary school, they have 2 national tests that always happen each year in January, February, the one, and then in June. And this is just made to study the pandemic, because like right in between the schools were closed, but the interesting thing is they were only closed for 8 weeks in the Netherlands, so kids were back in school by June and they did the test. And so they can basically look at how were these kids doing just before the closures and how are they doing just after the closures, and you look at this learning gains over these several months compared to the learning gains in previous cohorts. It's still not perfect, but it probably solves all the problems on a quantitative basis. And the result that they find is that kids in 2020 learned much less than others learned during the time, to the extent that there's a learning loss. If you would express this in how much learning there is, usually on average during one school year, this is 1/5 of a school year. And actually these 8 hours are literally 1/5 of a school year as well, meaning I think on average, that's what they conclude, the students made hardly any progress on average during these 8 weeks. So it's really, and they find strong, like the losses are much larger for kids from very low educated parents, and they argue in many dimensions this Dutch evidence is the best case scenario. So there were short school closures, just 8 weeks. Most countries had much longer ones. They have very equitable school funding, so it's really schools are well equipped everywhere. And if you look at the broadband penetration of schools, so the extent to which they have fast internet, it's basically they are #1 in the world. And so in that sense, they think probably it's going to be worse in other settings. Let me quickly talk about the second problem that most of these studies have, and I think that quantitatively that's the much more important one. And the direction of the bias here is pretty clear. particularly during and after the pandemic, there's huge non-participation, so attrition or non-participation in these tests. So kids didn't participate. And it's very likely that this is very selective, meaning it's not random who doesn't participate, but it's going to be those students who are hardest hit, who are maybe not even back in school, but the ones who really discontinued learning. Either they don't participate or the teachers tell them, you know, it actually doesn't make any sense, and there was much more voluntary participation in these times, and so they won't participate. And this will introduce upward bias when you just look at repeated cross-sectional data, meaning the worst kids don't participate, on average you're going to look better. So you're going to underestimate the skill loss. So the bias here is clear. But I did go, I played around a little bit with data just to show how huge this problem is. So most people who work with these data know these data are basically scaled to have a normal distribution, so like overall these test scores. And so if you just take a normal distribution by definition and you cut out the lowest 10% of kids, you will increase the mean achievement of the observed by the equivalent of 60 to 80% of a school year's learning. And if you think like if the school closures had a very bad effect, you would expect they may actually reduce it by a quarter of a year's learning or a third of a year's learning, maybe half a year's learning. But this bias is even bigger than that. You know, this is just huge. If you would drop the lowest 25%, like it's more than a year's learning, and several of these studies have like non-participation between 25, 40, or even 60%. And that really reduces what we can learn from them. So this is just to say we want to caution against too far-reaching interpretation of these other studies, but to the extent that they are there and there are surveys of that, you can see it on the list there. The evidence is somewhat more mixed, but on average they do find very large negative effects overall in all these dimensions, and always this inequality increase. To what extent this will actually be there in the long run is a much bigger question. There's two aspects of that. First of all, I mean, the only good evidence we have is for the Netherlands. It's just 8 weeks of school closures. Other countries have seen like school closures of more than 2/3 of a year by now. Of course, you cannot linearly extrapolate it to that. I mean, there's like both schools will have adjusted to that and gotten better. On the other hand, non-learning usually is cumulative, so it's a bit unclear how we can project out for that. And then even beyond that, when these individual students who were not in school now and have lost some skills, when they go through the other grades, the big question is there going to be fade out or persistence? So are they just going to recoup? And a lot of that will depend on what we're going to do over the next year, somewhere like on the policies. But this is kind of interesting that there's from several dimensions in recent years, we've seen studies that found that actually it seems like effects fade out on the test scores that you look at after a few years, but all of a sudden, if you can look at the long run, they all of a sudden re-emerge in a big earnings effect in the long run. So I think this fade out is often a measurement problem, and we've seen that for teacher effects, for classroom quality effects, for early childhood effects. They all actually have very persistent effects in the long run, even though you can't observe them in test scores in between. So I would think that prior evidence suggests substantial persistence of these learning losses, but who knows? I can't look into the future. I mean, you can just think about what's going to happen there. Okay, I'm basically out of time, I guess. So we did look a little bit. So there's other dimensions of cognitive skills, like you learn digital skills, or you actually may, by just learning by doing, learn how to self-regulate your learning at home. We have a couple of questions in the German survey showing that, like, for the majority of parents think that their kids actually did improve on these terms. So there may actually be some positive effects, and it's not quite clear how all this fits together. On the socio-emotional development, I mean, do I have to stop, or do I have whatever a few minutes that I really have to stop? So I think what we see there, so we, like all these studies, we did our own, but others show real negative effects on the socio-emotional well-being, stress, and so on of most children and youth. But it is actually, if you look at it, it's actually less severe than you would guess, particularly, I mean, most parents would actually say, for example, that the situation didn't really change, and some even say it's improved. So in my view, my interpretation of what we see here is that there is this group of students who are really hit hard socio-emotionally, and they're going to need a lot of help. But it's not going to be the average student. It's going to be a minority. And from what we know from psychological work, from like on other disasters, like when kids are really hit by very hard experiences, the interesting thing is that within a few years, these studies show that most children are very resilient and overcome these problems. And there's only a small minority that don't. And that would be my expectation here, actually. So it's probably going to be much easier for many kids to recoup from these bad experiences if we go back to normal interactions. But there's going to be a small group that is very hard, and they're going to need a lot of psychological help. So I don't want to downplay that. I just want to say that probably quantitatively it's a smaller part of the population. Okay, what does that mean in the long run? Maybe let me just tell you that. So we know that all these skills, both the cognitive skills and social skills, are very important for labor market outcomes. They are very positively related to your later earnings, to finding a job in the first place, and so on, and also at the macro level. I mean, we, with Eric Hanushek, have done this work showing that the test scores in math and science that we have done in the past are really the strongest predictors of countries' long-run GDP growth that you can find. And with that, you can do some calculations on what to expect there in terms of economic outcomes. And like back of the envelope calculation, these are very rough things. But if you would like a kid that loses about roughly 1/3 of a school year's learning in the long run would on average be expected to lose like 2.5% of income over their working life. So these are not peanuts, these are relevant numbers. And depending on like how much learning is lost, these can be bigger or smaller. Some children will not have lost anything, others will have much bigger losses. And similarly for like these, if you take the evidence from previous growth analyses and project that out into the future, it takes many years before you would actually see any effects in terms of growth, because these kids are not going to be in the labor market for a long while. But in the very long run, if you project out to the end of the century, for example, on average, GDP per capita would be reduced by 1.5% on average across over the whole entire space, if the current cohorts lose out 1/3 of a school year on average. It's all an if-then statement, and we just don't know where exactly we stand. Okay, so that means that the economic legacy can be very large, and then it depends on the policies. I guess we can discuss the policies in the discussion. I'm sorry that I went fully over.
Thank you very much. Now, this is a very rich report. I'm sure we will have also the opportunity to go back to parts of it this afternoon after the presentation that will be more on the Italian case. But now we have two excellent discussants. The first one is Barbara Biasi, fellow of the Fondazione Rodolfo Debenedetti from Yale University and currently at AF in Rome.
Okay.
So you want to use the microphone?
I have a mic here, so I think I'm fine. Yeah. All right. Slides? Grazie, Rodolfo. All right. Well, I want to start, actually, let me take my mask off. I want to start by thanking Tito and the organizers for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to read this very rich report, which I think offers a very nice way to conceptually think about the impact of the pandemic on the learning experiences of kids, but it also offers very interesting and important new empirical evidence on how both the kids and their families have been spending their time during the pandemic. I want to spend my time kind of thinking about 3 points of the report and elaborating a little bit more on them. The first one is the production function of student learning and how the different inputs that sort of generate achievement and learning might have changed during the pandemic. And I want to focus a little bit on some aspects that I think, because of lack of time and space, Ludger has had to be brief on, which I think is still important. Then I want to talk a little bit about the panel dimension of the time survey, which I thought was really interesting. And then I want to conclude by saying sort of what can we say about where we're going, how the future looks like, and what we should do to mitigate these losses. So I want to start again by going back to the production function of student learning. Please don't be scared by the math symbols on the slide. This is just a very simple representation of the way that learning sort of is formed as a function of attributes of the child. These are things like various types of ability, as well as effort, family inputs, and school inputs. The first thing I want to think about is the interaction between these three factors, and Ludger has talked a lot about the interaction between, for example, family's socioeconomic status and the inputs of the schools. One interaction that I thought was interesting was that between the certain attributes of the student and the school inputs. And in particular, I think there is a little bit by now of anecdotal evidence that seems to suggest that certain kids might actually have benefited from remote learning compared to learning that happens in school. And these are typically kids who suffer from, say, social anxiety or suffer from bullying. So I think this is sort of an important thing to keep in the back of our minds, because we can take the school closures as a sort of opportunity to learn how learning for different types of kids really happens. The second thing I want to talk about is teachers. So teachers are the most important input in the production of learning, and we know by the work of many people that effective teachers are essentially the most important thing to boost learning, and teacher quality is also correlated with the earnings of students once they enter the labor market. But teachers during the pandemic have been struggling as much as families and kids have, because their job has changed. Essentially from one day to the next, they have found themselves in the position of having to offer instruction online, which is something that they never did before. And even when they started to go back to the classroom, they essentially found something completely different, because they found students that had not been learning anything for many months, and in part they still had to continue providing some sort of remote learning. And because of this, teachers have struggled. Teachers are people, and in several cases, they are, actually in the majority of cases, they're women in a point in their life in which they also have kids in schooling age. So they have been struggling a lot, and we have a lot of anecdotal evidence on this, as well as nice empirical evidence that shows that mental health has declined in this time period. And because of this, there's been this sort of generalized worry across countries about teachers potentially leaving their job and sort of leaving schools empty, and also about the prospect of having really a hard time hiring, attracting talented people into the teaching job. The sort of last thing I want to mention regarding the production function of learning is one particular aspect in which family inputs can interact with school inputs, and this is something that Ludger has touched upon in his presentation, which is the switch from public schools to private schools, which of course, is not something that every family can do, but certain types of families have a much easier time doing, and it's something that definitely has occurred, at least in the US, which is where I was living during the pandemic, because private schools had the freedom in many cases to remain open while public schools has to close. And this is not just because bad because it creates inequalities across kids, but it's also bad because in some cases public schools have to rely on enrollment in order to stay open and to function well. And if private schools keep on attracting students that were previously in public schools, this is going to generate more and more issues. The second point I want to touch upon is very briefly on what we can learn from the panel dimension of the time use survey. I think that the fantastic thing about this survey is that they were able to observe students essentially at 3 points in time, so before the pandemic with retrospective retrospective questions, but also during 2 different school closures. And what we can see, this is just sort of repeating what Ludger has just shown, is that there was a switch from away from spending time on learning and studying towards things that we typically do not consider very productive, like watching TV or gaming or spending time on online media. And this was, this is just a comparison of pre-COVID with the spring of 2020. But then a thing that I thought was super interesting is that there was a little bit of a rebound from between 2020 and 2021. And so what I was wondering is whether perhaps, families and students perceive these 2 school closures in different ways. The first one was just an unexpected event and people didn't really know what to do, whereas the second one was perhaps an event that people started already to perceive as kind of the new normal, perhaps. And so I think it's interesting because I think if we think about the future, and hopefully in the future we won't have any additional school closures, touching wood, but we don't know what is going to happen. And I think this graph here paints a picture that I think has a little bit of a positive aspect in it. One thing that I want to mention are differences in lockdown impact or school closure impact by school age, because it is the case in some countries, and definitely it was the case in Italy, that when the government was deciding which schools to close and which to keep open, the priority was actually given to high schools to remain open. And so those were the ones that were prioritized, but we know from a lot of literature that cognitive and non-cognitive skills are shaped really early in a child's life. And so I think it would be interesting, if there are future waves of this survey, or if it is possible to sort of break down the data a little bit more to understand how school closures have impacted the allocation of time across kids that are at different points in their educational career. And then really the last thing I want to say is that in thinking about where we're going and what we can do in the future to mitigate the learning losses that seem evident, again, going back to what I was saying before, I think that one important and potentially the most important learning input is teachers, and they also need support in terms of preparation and tools to close the learning gaps that these school closures have opened, but also in terms of mental health. We've seen before that teachers have been struggling, and the mental health support is not just a sort of additional benefit, but to me it seems really, really key to make sure that that the whole education experience remains at a high level of quality. And the last thing is that we have to make sure that teachers have the digital tools and the skills to provide remote instruction if there is the need in the future to continue to provide it, especially for it might be the case that there are some groups of students that will continue to need remote instruction. It's not just the children that need a computer and an internet connection, it's also the teachers who very often are in households in which there are other members, sometimes kids, who also need a computer. This is not, it's not obvious that these tools are there already. And then really the last thing I want to say is that I want to be a little bit skeptical in trying to predict what will happen ahead using existing estimates on the return to skills, just because I think the most important aspect of this pandemic is that by definition it's global, so it's affecting everybody. And typically, us as economists, we worry a lot about what we call general equilibrium effects, which again stress the difficulty of extrapolating from any estimates using past data to say something about the future when everybody is affected. So this is just what I'm going to end. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this very effective discussion, and also for taking the teacher perspective, which is something I particularly like. Now we have Marta de Philippis, who is from also fellow of the Fondazione and from the Bank of Italy.
Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me the opportunity to discuss this very interesting and super relevant report. So one of the reasons why I think the report is super relevant is exactly the fact that one of the specificity of this COVID crisis relative to previous recession is that schools remain closed. And this is one of the reasons why the effects of this crisis might be particularly long-lasting, and exactly because it is not something that happened in previous recession, we need evidence about this, about what happened, and about the anatomies of these learning losses, and this report exactly fills this gap. So there are a lot of things to say about this report, and it was actually difficult for me to select a few ones. So my discussion will cover 4 points. The first one is that I really like the focus on how remote teaching was implemented. The idea is that what we knew before the COVID crisis about the effect of school closure on children was coming from papers that looked at situations where schools were completely closed because of teacher strikes, because of shorter school years, and so on. But what happened during the COVID crisis is that there was a substitution between in-presence teaching and online teaching. And then it is crucial to understand how this remote teaching was implemented by teachers and by schools to actually get at what might be the learning losses. And in the German survey, there is some very interesting evidence showing, for instance, exactly the fact that during the second wave of school closure, the intensity of daily online lectures increased from 7 to 25%, but it was still super low. And the dominant way of teaching was through individual homework. And also the other interesting thing is that there was heterogeneity by socioeconomic status, and this might enlarge existing inequality. So at the Bank of Italy, we also ran a survey to parents in Italy in March 2021, and we asked parents exactly this question. So how was online teaching implemented in Italy? And this is the graph. It plots the share of schooling hours covered by face-to-face online lectures during the time of school closure. And I think there are 2 takeaways. One is that there is a very large heterogeneity, and the second one is that the share is larger among older students. And then while investigating on this data, we actually realized that this heterogeneity was correlated with the length of school closure in Italy. So in this graph, the red bars, the green bars, are the share of teaching hours covered by in-present school. And here we see that so while in the first wave of the pandemic, all schools were closed homogeneously, in the second wave, there was heterogeneity, and the heterogeneity was by age, so secondary school were closed much more, and also by regions. So in some region in the south of Italy, for instance, Campania is a good example, primary school remained closed also for a very long period of time. But the interesting thing here is that where the red bar, where the green bar is shorter, the light blue bar is longer, and the light blue bar tells what is the share of remote teaching implemented through interactive face-to-face classes. So there seemed to be a compensation mechanism that where schools remain closed for longer, then schools try to provide a type of remote learning that was more similar to in-present schooling, at least in Italy. The second point I want to make is about time investment by parents. So in the report, there is some very nice evidence about how do parents spend their time with children during school closure, whether doing homework, watching TV together, and so on. So I think this is a very complex phenomenon, and there is still a lot of things we still don't know about this fact, because what happened during the COVID crisis was exactly that there was a contemporaneous shock both to children because their schools closed, but also to parents because most lost their job or had to work from home. And it is interesting to understand how these two effects interacted with each other, so whether this implied that there was an amplification of the overall effect or actually a reduction of the overall effect. One reason why there could be an amplification is that there might be larger psychological costs. So if every member in the household is shocked, maybe the aggregate psychological cost might be larger. One reason why they can compensate each other is that it might be that parents who lost their job or parents who can work from home have more time to help their children with homework. And I think this evidence was found for the UK, and we also find it for Italy. And maybe it's interesting to see also if this is the case in Germany, so if we can observe this type of compensation mechanism. And then there are things we completely don't know and on which we need to understand and provide evidence. So for instance, how were parents able to combine remote working with helping their children with homework at school, whether this reduced their productivity, whether this might have long-term effect on their career or on children, and so on. My third point is about heterogeneity. So it is important to understand the relevant dimension of heterogeneity, because what we need to do now is to understand which children suffer the most and try to intervene in a timely way and to try to close these gaps. And the paper basically discusses two main dimensions of heterogeneity: socioeconomic status and prior achievement. But I found surprising that for Germany, for many relevant outcomes, there is actually no overwhelming evidence supporting heterogeneity by socioeconomic status of the parents. And then I start thinking that maybe socioeconomic status by itself might not be enough to actually identify the set of children that suffer the most. And maybe you can also try to look at how it interacts with age. That is not considered so far in the report. So we know, for instance, that for a low-educated parent, it is more difficult to help older children because they don't, maybe the material is too difficult for them. And we also know there is a lot of evidence showing that these households were with the lowest availability of digital devices during the pandemic were poor households with younger kids. So there might be interesting way by which these two elements interact. So in our survey on Italy on parents, we actually find that there is, it was interesting to look at the two dimensions together. So this is the share of households that will increase their time helping children with studying while schools were closed. And one thing, it is clear that where there are younger kids, households had to increase much more the time spent helping them with homework. But the other thing that is interesting is that we find this gradient by socioeconomic status of the parent only for older children. And one of the reasons might be exactly the fact that these parents might not have been able to help these children with their homework. My last point is about the topic of this conference, so long-term effects. So in the structural model that I discussed at the end of the report, the main mechanism why the long-term effect might be very long-lasting is this idea that the gaps will be amplified over time. So a loss now in my learning implies a reduction in my marginal productivity and I will reduce my investment in teaching, and my parents will reduce my investment in teaching because the marginal return to invest in me are lower since I'm lower achiever, and this will generate a vicious cycle, and then the gaps will amplify and will get much greater later on. And this happens much more for younger kids because they have not yet accumulated a lot of human capital. The other thing that I think it is important to think about is that during the education process there are some critical ages, some critical steps where students have to make decisions that then is very difficult to change, and the kind of irreversible decision, like for instance when they have to choose whether to drop out of high school or which high school track to select in, or whether to go on and study at the university and so on. So for policymakers at the moment it is very important first to try to immediately close the existing gaps, so especially for younger kids, so to avoid this amplification effect, and second to address students at these critical ages to avoid that a temporary shock might imply changing the decision that might have very long-lasting effects. And for this, we actually need timely micro data on learning losses, and we also need to have a panel dimension so that we can actually follow children over time and see whether these learning losses will become larger, or will actually schools will be actually able to close them immediately. Thank you very much. That's it.
Marta, very good. So Ludger, you want to say something as a matter of reply, or you prefer to perhaps intervene in the afternoon session, as you wish?
Comments by both of you. I think thanks so much. They are super helpful and really complementary to what I was saying. And partly, I mean, both raised some issues that are not there in the report and should be. I totally agree. So I totally agree with these things, and we should rather go into a discussion. Maybe just quickly on the final point, which I found interesting. So there are these two structural models that are in a sense very similar. The one is more micro, the other more macro. The funny thing is that the Fuchs-Schindler paper, they find longer or like hypothesize in a sense really, because stronger effects for younger children because of these dynamic complementarities. The other paper literally finds exactly the opposite, which shows you to how much is driven by specific assumptions that you put in there, which ultimately is there because they say, but the younger children have more time in school to remain and to recoup some of that, whereas the older children actually can't. So I think it just shows how little we know about these things, but how important these are. I totally agree. And then we can only answer that with data.
Thank you so much. And I'm sure in the afternoon we are going to go back to many of these in this very rich report, and we'll discuss also more in detail the case of Italy, and Marta brought new evidence in that case.